Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy stands as one of the great cinematic accomplishments ever. Released by New Line Cinema over the course of 3 Christmases between 2001 and 2003, the films were a generational touchstone.
You're a liar and a thief!
Collectively, the trilogy grossed over $2.9 billion at the global box office on a combined budget of $281 million, or half the budget of the first season of Rings of Power adjusted for inflation. The franchise made at least another $400 million in home media because that was back before Hollywood destroyed their sustainable business model and used to earn revenue on secondary and even tertiary markets. The 3 films won a combined 17 Oscars, including a clean sweep for Return of the King, which won all 11 Oscars it was nominated for, and is still tied as the most awarded film in Oscars history.
Peter Jackson, Lord of the Rings.
The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King.
Return of the King.
The Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings.
The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King.
Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King.
The films are still routinely screened in cinemas as all-day marathons, enjoying the sort of afterlife that most movies can only dream of. These 3 films tell a complete story. They wrap up in a very decisive manner. Indeed, there's an old Billy Crystal joke about how Return of the King won 11 Oscars.
11 nominations, 1 for each ending. And let me tell you something else, folks.
As easy as it is to joke about the Bachelor-style reveals of the cast joining Frodo in his bedroom at the end of the movie, it all feels earned. Well, maybe not the slow motion. Reaching the end of the movies, there's a clear sense of emotional catharsis and resolution. The films resonated because they feel like a complete journey, and every journey reaches a destination. So, inevitably, over the past decade, we have been completely and mercilessly saturated with Lord of the Rings content. 3 Hobbit movies, multiple seasons of the most expensive television show ever made, an anime release in cinemas for this Christmas, an upcoming movie focusing on Gollum. That was originally rumored to be a 2-parter, but don't worry, it's actually 2 separate Lord of the Rings movies. Apparently, the Lord of the Rings movies will continue until morale improves. Now, look, we all know why they're doing this. These spin-offs, prequels, brand extensions have and will continue to make a lot of money for the rights holders, and Smaug is nothing if not an aspirational figure. And yet, it's hard not to feel like maybe not everything needs to be a vast, sprawling, and unending multimedia franchise. Maybe a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. Maybe a story is worth telling because it ends. Maybe Hollywood needs to get out of this Hobbit. Maybe the legacy of these epics shouldn't be squandered for a mere few $1 million. Maybe this relentless and merciless exploitation of the property is just going to leave audiences sour. Oh man, that's tough even for me. As we're releasing this episode, Halloween is coming up, and I've been thinking about the major horror movie franchises. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, the horror series that helped establish New Line Cinema, to the point that the studio that released The Lord of the Rings is still known today as the house that Freddy built.
What a fine time, yes!
The Nightmare franchise has always been one of the big 4 horror series, alongside Halloween, Texas Chainsaw, and Friday the 13th. But it's also always been curiously contained, allowing for the crossover Freddy vs. Jason in 2003 or the ill-advised reboot in 2010. The Nightmare on Elm Street franchise largely consists of 6 films released between November 1984 and September 1991, 2 seasons of Freddy's Nightmares which ran between October 1988 and March 1990, and Wes Craven's New Nightmare serving as a coda in October 1994. Throw that all together and that's a pretty neat decade of Freddy. Recently, actor Robert Englund suggested that he was too old and thick to play Freddy now. Setting aside that this is the internet and Englund might as well have been setting a thirst trap for, quote, thick daddy Freddy Summer, aka, baby these aren't burns, I'm just hot for you, aka, yes, those are knife hand gloves in my pocket, but I am also happy to see you.
Wanna suck the face?
I was still strangely moved by Englund's confession. And while it inevitably set off a round of fan castings and reboot ideas,
The fans, God bless them, they're clamoring for more.
I don't really need to see Freddy again. Maybe that solid decade of Freddy was a good run. Well, maybe it averaged out to a good run. course, it's easy to be nostalgic about the way that movies used to work. There have always been sequels and franchises and crossovers dating back to the earliest days of the medium. Studios have always sought to capitalize on known brand and name recognition to bring audiences into theaters. There has always been a crass commercialism to Hollywood film production, and that's just the way it works. Art and commerce have always existed in a precarious balance. However, crucially, there always was a sense of balance. Things moved in cycles. Old franchises inevitably gave way to new ones. If you look at the global top 10 films at the box office in 2001, the year Fellowship of the Ring was released, the bottom 4 entries on the list are populated by 3 sequels and a remake. In contrast, the top 4 are all first entries in new franchises and film series. If you jump forward a decade to 2011, the only entry in the top 10 that isn't a sequel in an existing series is a theatrical adaptation of The Smurfs. So far this year, the top 11 movies at the global box office are all sequels. Most of them are sequels to franchises that are a decade or older. Depending on how one counts the Planet of the Apes film in the list, more than half of them are sequels to franchises that are over 20 years old. That doesn't really seem like a sustainable business model. And to be clear, this isn't even a post-COVID slump. Summer box office revenues are down 10% on last year, which is a lot, even allowing for the long tail of the studio's self-inflicted wounds from last year's writers and actors strikes. And look, as these situations grow increasingly desperate, it makes sense that studios will cling to franchising their hits. Disney recovered from a fairly dire couple of years with the 1-2 sequel punch of Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine, grossing a combined $3 billion.
Disney brought him back. They're going to make him do this till he's 90.
However, Disney is only in those dire straits in the first place because of a string of underperforming attempts to exploit their other franchises. Recently, Warners have had similar issues with sequels like The Flash, or Shazam 2, or Joker, Folly and Electric Boogaloo. Indeed, part of what feels so interesting about Todd Phillips' Joker sequel, outside of the fact that it feels like a 2-hour and 20-minute adaptation of that scene in The Dark Knight where the Joker lights a big pile of cash on fire, is the strong sense that it's a sequel that hates its own existence. This movie is an inevitable outcome of this broken process, and the sequel's unpleasantness and contempt for, well, everything, feels like some small act of rebellion in this dysfunctional studio system. While this impulse to extend franchises is the inevitable byproduct of late capitalism, it does brush up against the creative necessity for stories to have endings. Sure, the version of Hugh Jackman's Wolverine that appears in Deadpool and Wolverine isn't technically or exactly the same version that had the satisfying ending in Logan, but the film still hinges on the audience's association to the actor and character that drove that film, and it also relies heavily on the character's relationship to the version of Laura from Logan.
I got to have a life because of you. I got to grow up because of you.
It's Schrodinger's emotional continuity, and it demonstrates how precarious this sort of franchising is. In other cases, efforts to write around clear and defined endings mean that these franchises are stuck in place, doubling back over one another and turning inwards like septic toenails. Because Return of the King has such a definitive ending, every follow-up has to be a prequel, meaning that the audience is subjected to hours upon hours of story about the build-up to a story that was already self-contained and satisfying. It mostly consists of just staging sequences that remind audiences of things that they already liked, and adding back in a whole bunch of mythos-adjacent nonsense that was trimmed from the original films for good reason.
Folk used to call me Bombadil. Tom Bombadil.
Bombadil, Bombadil, Bomba, 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 Bombadil. Modern Star Wars can't look past The Rise of Skywalker. Of the 5 shows that comprise the modern Star Trek franchise, only one of them takes place further in the future than the flash forward to the final episode of Star Trek Voyager, which, to bring us back to The Lord of the Rings, also broadcast in 2001. And even then, the show that does actually take place in the future of the Star Trek franchise took 2 full seasons to make that leap. This is emblematic of this modern franchising impulse. It's an impulse to generate endless supplies of content, but very little of it can be allowed to evolve or grow. It instead has to serve as an endless repetition and relitigation of what the audience has already seen, an unconvincing facsimile of what the viewer loved in the first place, shorn of any context, creativity, or novelty. And look, it's important to be clear here. Bad sequels and spin-offs don't really diminish the original work in any meaningful way. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies remain masterpieces. They can be revisited at any time. However, these gems do get drowned in a sea of endless content soup, watered down and diluted by unconvincing imitations. While the work itself remains undiminished, it becomes harder to see it for what it is amid the saturation and concentration of content around it. So, what can be done? Honestly, very little. There are a handful of cases where the creative talent involved in a major work has the integrity to maintain its unblemished and undiluted status. Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, for example, remains unsmeared by the greasy fingers of cynical cash-ins like The Flash, in large part because Christian Bale has made it clear that he won't reprise the role without Nolan's involvement. Allowing for a few animated cameos, the Star Trek Deep Space Nine cast seemed to remain largely separate from the recent Star Trek franchise, minimizing the impact of those spin-offs on the original's legacy. However, this sort of integrity is so rare as to be non-existent. It cannot be relied upon. In other cases, directors like Lana Wachowski have understood that these sequels are going to happen with or without them, and so they've taken the studio money to make deeply personal works.
It changed everything.
Doesn't feel like it changed anything. The Matrix is the same or worse. And I'm back where I started.
The best thing that can happen is probably the public domain, the entry of these properties into the Creative Commons. Once studios cease to exclusively own these characters and concepts, when anybody can do anything that they want with them, there's less motivation to ruthlessly wring whatever profit they can from them. While you'll undoubtedly end up with nonsense like Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, which is admittedly far from the worst IP play that I've seen this year, you'll also probably get more interesting and personal takes like Vera Drake's The People's Joker. Of course, the public domain is a long way off for these properties. We still have decades of merciless exploitation of properties like Lord of the Rings to look forward to. However, if studios like Amazon and Warner's have their way, the property might end up a lot less precious than it once was. And audiences might end up with one ring to rue them all. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.